So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our 7th webinar in the SEL webinar series. And today, I'm very happy to invite our colleagues over at the RTI Center to share their information, their take, their perspective on how we integrate SEL with the PBIS framework. Emily O'Connor and Kim Gulbranson will both introduce themselves momentarily. Just to let you know that you are all muted, so if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat box. We will be monitoring that, and I will make sure that Emily and Kim get your question. We'll save some time at the end too, but if you have something that's coming up or you need clarity, feel free to just ask questions through that chat box whenever you are ready. And with that, I am going to, and just one more thing, people ask, this will be recorded. We will post it on the website where all of these are being archived. It just needs to get closed captioned before we can post it. So stay patient, but these will be recorded. So Emily and Kim, if you would like to go ahead and get started, thanks for joining us.
Great, thank you, Beth.
Emily, Kim, can you guys hear me?
I'm here. I can, thank you. Kim, are you still with us?
Can you hear me?
Can you guys hear me? Can you guys hear me?
Okay. Yes.
Did you hear my whole introduction? Because I think it might have cut out, but okay.
I heard it.
All right.
I think it was my audio.
Okay. So without further ado, take it away, ladies.
Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Kim Gulbranson, and just a little bit about me before we get started. I was a school psychologist for 18 years, and I supported SEL first at the school level, mainly in classrooms, and then district-wide in a large district. And then for the past several years, I now work for the Wisconsin RTI Center, and with Emily and other colleagues have worked to support others in implementation of PBIS and SEL when they are supporting both collectively. Emily?
And I'm Emily O'Connor. I work with Kim at the Wisconsin RTI Center. I am a technical assistance coordinator in the southeast region of the state. So that includes primarily CISA 1 schools and districts, and I support schools and districts in their implementation of an equitable multi-level system of support, specifically with a background in PBIS implementation. I started off in schools as a school social worker, and then quickly was drawn to a more comprehensive framework of addressing the whole child within the school setting, which is how I kind of got hooked on PBIS. But then in the midst of all of that, was fortunate to work at multiple levels of schools implementing social and emotional learning kind of within that framework. So it's exciting to do this work and be learning right along with you and Kim and Beth, and to continue this conversation today.
Okay. And with that, we're going to talk about, there are a lot of different things that we could focus on when Emily and I were planning this, on how if you're implementing or considering implementing both PBIS and SEL supports and practices of different things to consider.
Kim, just
that implementation.
Kim, I don't mean to interrupt you, but you're a little difficult to hear.
I am. Okay.
That's better.
That's better?
Yes.
Okay. Let me know we have issues again, and I will work on that. Okay, thanks, Beth. But one of the areas where we see a lot of opportunity is within the PBIS school-wide and classroom matrices. So that's going to be a big area that we focus on in this webinar. And we're hoping by the time the webinar is over that you'll be able to do a couple of things. First of all, our first objective is just to give you some considerations for creating and refining your matrices, not meaning like you do a big overhaul, but that there might be some things that you might need to logistically tweak And if you're just starting to think about creating a matrix or revisiting your matrix, that we give you some considerations around that. And we hope that you understand how working, considering SEL and within the matrices is really helps to establish some common language around what kids need to be successful and for establishing predictability for both staff and students. And also with regard to that first objective and the matrix, for you to think about what SEL competencies are already within your matrices, if you have one, and that the matrix, which is really based on data, helps support the teaching and reinforcing of SEL competencies needed for success in school. So that's our first hope for, sounds like a lot. And then our second objective for today is just that we hope that you develop a better understanding of how the matrix, which is based on data, how when paired with good instructional practices, helps support the teaching and reinforcing of SEL competencies needed for success in school, and that kids will have a hard time developing and using their competencies without good instructional practices and support. So with that, we're going to go into some more specifics. And for those of you, this is the time of year for those of you that are already implementing PBIS. This is typically the time of year schools assess their work to improve student outcomes through PBIS. And this presentation specifically supports two main areas. We have the numbers there because this is based on the TFI. At first, in terms of behavioral expectations, it helps it'll give some considerations for behavioral expectations, defining the relevant expectations and indicators in school-wide areas, and ensuring that expectations are visible. And then also considering Tier 1 features, especially expectations, and a little bit about acknowledgement today, that they're implemented within classrooms and consistent with the school-wide expectations. So just wanted to make that link for those of you that are measuring your implementation of PBIS and where that really fits. Okay. So most of you are probably familiar with this, but we felt like we just needed to give some definitions to social emotional learning in PBIS. The main thing with social emotional learning is that it's a process, it's not a thing, and it's a process by which people learn and apply their knowledge, attitudes, and skills in the 5 competency areas, which are self-awareness, social awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, and relationship skills. And within each of those competencies are many, many, many social and emotional skills that fit within that. I think the other big thing is that the process really helps people to understand and manage emotions more and to maintain positive relationships, and as you can see, some other things that are mentioned in this slide. But again, it's really a process. Okay, Emily. And then positive behavioral interventions and supports is really about effective adult instructional practices. It's about adult practices. So it's your behavioral support system, and it ensures that the adult practices are matched to student needs. If you're implementing PBIS already, it also ensures SEL has an efficient system to map onto. It's also a way of ensuring that we as adults do things differently. So first and foremost, it aligns adult behaviors, and it moves us from one and done teaching to effective instructional practices. And what I mean by that is, okay, we taught a 15-minute lesson on this thing, this skill, and now we're done, right? It's really more about how do we provide ongoing supports, which we'll talk about a little bit later, over time, so it's not one and done. Okay, Emily. Another thing that we like to point out, because we get this question a lot, and Beth, I'm sure you might get this one too, is that sometimes people think, like, we'll ask, we already support SEL, but now we're wondering about implementing PBIS, like which one should we keep and which one should we stop doing? Or we're already implementing PBIS and we really want to look at our, look at SEL more. And a lot of times people think you can only do one, but they're not really competing initiatives. They're really, if you are doing or you're considering both, there's definitely ways that they can both support each other. And that PBIS, your PBIS system can support some of the work done around SEL, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail. One example I think of is when you look at the outcomes for PBIS and you look at the outcomes for SEL, like the student outcomes, you see things like increased academic scores, improved teacher satisfaction and well-being, decreases in emotional distress, improved emotional regulation, and increases in positive behavior, decreases in negative behaviors. And with all of those, when you think of what each accomplishes, if you are looking at supporting both in a more efficient way, so they're not implemented completely separately within your school and building, which takes a lot of resources, that if you implement together, just think of the outcomes that you could get. So just wanted to clarify how we see PBIS and SEL if you're implementing both. Okay, Emily. Actually, Emily, can you go back quick? Sorry about that. So the SEL practice competency, the SEL practices that you adopt in your buildings will fit with your continuum, and they will help enhance behavioral and academic outcomes for all students. And I think the only other thing I wanted to mention here is that there are ways of mapping your social emotional competencies within your school-wide PBIS expectations, and Emily's going to talk about that in a little bit. Okay, I'm ready, Emily. The other thing we just want to, I guess, set out there is that oftentimes in our work, especially around SEL, we tend to go right to the tier 2 or tier 3 supports of supporting small groups of students or individual students, and that can really be a miss if we don't first focus on the universal and what all kids need. So for example, if we're supporting, if we just decide to implement SEL by just pulling out a few kids from a particular classroom, or just implementing in just a few classrooms in the school building, or just teaching a lesson, once a week for 10 minutes, that really isn't universal SEL support, and that it's more, if we expect kids, or if kids are struggling, it could be struggling. Often it is because they're struggling because they haven't had any universal support within the school building. So we just wanted to provide some clarification and some consideration around universal and how really important that is. Ooh. And how that's really good. Just like, oh, it's probably my audio again. So anyway, just something to consider that that's what we'll be talking about today. Our focus is really on the universal support. Okay, Emily.
So to just kind of expand that and go a little bit deeper, when we say universal, we cannot overemphasize enough that universal includes classroom systems. And as Kim referenced in the beginning, 2 of the core features of PBIS implementation that are outlined in that self-assessment are kind of defining these things and what they mean universally in all environments of the school, the hallway, lunchroom, bathrooms, etc. But also really critical to make sure all of those are intentionally implemented all those pieces of implementation take place within the classroom by classroom teachers and by support staff and by those that are interacting with the students each day. Because the reality is students spend about 70% of their day within a classroom. So if schools are implementing PBIS, and if you are already trained and have adopted implementation of PBIS, you know that 70% of a student's day takes place in the classroom. So if we're not paying attention to implementation in the classroom for SEL and PBIS, then students are kind of missing 70% of that instruction and that support. So the other thing that's really important to keep in mind is that there are different skills that need to be demonstrated within each environment of the school. And so in a classroom setting, students might be doing much more higher order thinking and a lot more complex peer collaboration, participation in robust discussions within their content specific expectations, math, reading. So, within the classroom, they're expected to demonstrate more complex social and emotional and skills, as well as kind of behavioral skills that are different than those required of during passing time or in the classroom environment, or in the cafeteria environment. So we're going to dig into this and kind of what this looks like within that classroom setting. So like Kim referenced, we're really focusing specifically today on the matrix and how we create a classroom matrix is what we're going to really think about today that reflects the relevant skills that students need to demonstrate within the academic routines of that classroom setting or that class period. So how do we start with that though? And the important thing to think about is prior to getting grade level teachers together or content specific teachers together to create classroom matrices, we really want to take a look at the data that we have available right now so that the data can help start to inform or be a piece of what informs the skills, knowing what skills students need to be taught and supported in an ongoing way within those classroom routines. The couple of points of data that you might consider that might be easily available that we've listed up here just to get you thinking is one of them might be some climate survey data. A lot of schools are, on an annual basis doing some type of climate survey with staff, with students, and with family members. And that can be really valuable in looking at, what skills do we feel students are really firmly supported with within the school environment, and what skills do we feel like we could improve our supports on. So one school that we've worked with in the past took a look at their climate survey data, and it showed that students and parents didn't really feel like students had opportunities to develop strategies to manage their feelings and actions. And teachers reported that they just didn't feel like they had the right materials and resources to support students in developing those skills, like managing emotions. And so they dug into this data and to kind of say, okay, well, what might be some root causes of this, or what might be some potential reasons for this? And it was decided that staff needed some more professional learning opportunities to more adequately and feel more confident in supporting students in this within their content areas. And the school needed to kind of look at maybe adopting some social skills curriculum to help teachers carry that responsibility out. And then they also started looking at more behavioral patterns through office discipline referrals and started a screening process to look more deeply at specific skill strands that the teaching staff could incorporate within their content areas. The other one that's common for schools that are implementing PBIS is the collection of minor behaviors, just so that can be used to inform, again, adult behaviors, adult supports of students. And so we had another school that showed a high rate of minors for inappropriate verbal comments that were typically occurring during the math instructional block. And so when the team took a look at the data and pulled in some teachers to kind of help them problem solve around this data, it was determined that students really needed some more explicit teaching and practice in perspective taking and managing strong emotions. This particular school had recently adopted a new math curriculum that incorporated a lot of collaboration and problem solving that was very much a part of the math curriculum, but teachers felt, again, kind of ill-equipped to teach those softer skills, those social emotional skills within that context. So they decided that they were going to use their anchor charts just like they would for academic skills and really be very clear about the social emotional skills within that. And really start to be very purposeful and intentional in that instruction. And so this is just a couple of really quick examples of how you might start to tease out particular skills that you really want to be very intentional and specific about within your matrix. And again, kind of using your matrix as your jumping off point or your starting point for your instructional practices. You know, kind of use your data to help make some of those decisions about what's going to be prioritized and not. The other thing you heard me say, just kind of within that last piece, is that teaching component. So, you know, if students don't know how to swim, we teach. If students don't know how to drive, we teach. You know, all that great quote. And so if students don't have these skills, we want to take that instructional approach. We want to directly teach and support those skills. Using the data, defining the skills, and then making that an ongoing living document. The matrix, you know, one of the things that sometimes we hear that schools have done is they've created a matrix after they went to Tier 1 training. And they even did it within classrooms, but it's the same matrix that has existed and been used for 7 years without coming back to it for further reflection, refinement, and edits based on the students that are being served that year or that semester. So we really encourage schools to, again, take a look at that data and say, are we still meeting the needs of our students through our instruction? And if not, maybe we need to address instructional practice, but also we might consider, are we really hitting the skills that our students need, and have we concretely named them within our matrix? And again, the other thing is we want to make sure that we define those skills for all environments or the academic routines within classrooms. Like Kim said earlier, what this matrix does is create a common language for the school community, for the classroom community. And it really starts to simplify strategies that are given to students to use to manage their emotions or to help problem solve or start conversations with their peers. And it creates some consistency across the school, across grade levels, and across the student's day, even within that same classroom. That also kind of helps to make things a little bit more predictable. We know through trauma-informed research and supports that it is incredibly important to make our environment safe and predictable so that students feel like they have the supports they need in order to be successful academically and socially and emotionally. The other thing that the matrix does is it kind of creates a great basis for the lesson plans that we're going to develop, that will be developed to actively teach and support those skills. So it's something that all the instructional staff and support staff can refer back to and say, okay, here's a lesson on managing emotions or using I statements or asking for help. And here's how we're all going to collectively teach that. Okay, so here's a lot. I don't know if everybody can read this. I can read it on my screen, but I know that there's a lot on here. And this is an example of a classroom matrix that has a number of skills that are expected to be used within the classroom environment. And if you see on the left-hand side, there are some what we call expectations. So if you've been to PBIS training and are implementing, 3 to 5 positively stated expectations are one of the first things you do at training. Start to think about what that means for your school. And for this school, it was be responsible, be respectful, be engaged. And at the top, you see more of those academic routines within the classroom. So learning, just kind of always applicable within our learning environment. Here is what is expected. Whole group learning, group or partner learning, and then independent learning is how this particular classroom teacher generated that and is teaching to this matrix. So those, and then within that, all of those little bullet points within the matrix are what we call indicators. So they're things that we want to look for to show up within classroom instruction. They're indicators. So what are the indicators that students are, showing that they are participating in whole group learning, in being responsible and being respectful? We're going to point out just a few of these and then speak more specifically to a couple of others. Let's see. Couple of other things, let's see. So maintain academic integrity. Your work is your own, under be respectful and under independent learning. So that one, when this classroom teacher put this in, it was actually part of a larger conversation within the school. The school had an increase in academic integrity violations. So that was something that was documented through their minors or their majors. And the school started thinking, well, why is it that we have academic integrity violations? Our kids should know not to copy homework or not to pull things from the internet and claim it as their own. This is something we teach. And after they kind of looked at their climate survey data and talked with students and families, they realized that students were experiencing such a high level of anxiety and need for kind of high performance within the school environment. And because of the other academic, demands that were placed on them, it was contributing to students, kind of not claiming their work as their own. So that became something that across grade levels and across content areas, they really started to teach and support, and it landed in classroom teachers' matrices as a very purposeful way to kind of come back to think about how do we make sure that we make students, or help students make good decisions within that. They also had a larger conversation around some system things that they could do as a school to kind of alleviate that anxiety to begin with. So I think that's important to note too, that based on their data, they kind of did a both and. The other one that I'll point out here is actively listen to the teacher and speaker. So that's something that can be really seen through a concretely behavioral lens, right? Like eyes at the speaker and, hands in your lap, or however that teacher is defining what that looks like to them. But there are so many other deeper level skills that actually contribute to a student actively listening to the teacher or speaker that need to be taught and supported. We should get back to that in just a moment. The other one that we're going to talk through in just a moment is express emotions in a way that keeps others safe and your image clean. And so how do students participate in a robust, lively discussion on, let's say, reading a text from their ELA curriculum, so to speak. And so how do they do that? How do they disagree with one another? Or how do they have strong opinions, but also do it in a way that is respectful of their peers, in a way that keeps themselves looking like a contributing member of the school and of the classroom discussion, but also kind of being respectful of other people's opinions and diverse ways of thinking. So let's look at one, that first one, that actively listen to the teacher or speaker, which was one of the indicators that I had pointed out. So I'll give you a moment to just look over and read kind of through this on your own. And then I'm going to just point a couple of things out. So there's a lot on here. You know, if I think about my own self and what I do to actively listen within a work environment, or within a meeting, within dialogue, even with my friends, there are different strategies that I employ, and there are different things I need to be considerate of when I am trying to do that, when I'm actively trying to do that. And then we put ourselves in the position of a 14-year-old or an 8-year-old that's learning this skill still and needing to kind of decipher what's important, what's not. How do you multitask? How do you take notes and actively listen to the teacher and speaker, etc.? And so some of these skills that show up are really, you start to see some of those social emotional skills kind of being teased out more purposely, like self-management and social awareness. You know, a teacher might end up saying something to the effect of like, eyes on the teacher, put things away, pencils are down, focusing attention on the speaker. And those are all well and good. But if I still don't have some deeper level skills, that might be hard to do. The other thing that's really important to do when we're teaching these skills is to give students the why, so that they can connect what they're doing now with what is needed of them in the future, so that they can start to transfer that learning to other environments or other situations. So you'll see here, why is it important to actively listen to the teacher and speaker? Well, so that you can obtain information, learn, avoid misunderstanding, and the speaker teacher knows that you are paying attention. You know, those are the reasons why it is important to practice active listening. Kim, can you speak to a little bit more about how these social emotional learning skills show up within this particular indicator, or this particular skill that might show up on a matrix?
Sure. So when Emily mentioned this, when she showed the example of the matrix, obviously actively listen to the teacher speaker is not like, there's some skills that if students were supported with, and if they had those skills, they would be far more effective in being able to actively listen to the teacher and speaker. And I have a couple examples on the screen, but I'll share some others. So for example, paraphrasing is one social and emotional skill that would help students actively listen to the teacher or speaker. Following directions, understanding others' perspectives, self-talk for listening, nonverbal communication skills, focusing attention, like I have up there. There are any number of skills that, when broken down, taught, supported, would further support that bigger actively listening. And it may, you know, what those skills are may also depend in part, like Emily mentioned, on how you're defining actively listening to the teacher and speaker. But the point is when you look at the matrix and you look at how that connects with SEL, there are many SEL skills that further support students in being able to be successful with these larger areas. Emily, is there anything you wanted to add to this one?
No, thank you. That was great.
Okay.
The next one that we'll kind of think about, you know, and dig into and give you some things to think about within that matrix and what are the implications for instruction is the one that we pulled out that was express emotions in a way that keeps others safe and your image clean. And it's important to keep in mind that these skills really do need to be taught through kind of some social skill lessons, but also through modeling and practicing, reminders. You know, that school that was using anchor charts, the teachers found that was really helpful because it was a way for them to say, okay, we're going to engage in whole group discussions today around a text that will bring up varying opinions. And so we are going to practice expressing emotions in a way that keeps others safe and your image clean to connect both the academic and the social emotional skill that's needed within that routine, that whole group learning or that whole group discussion. So we want to consider what would go into this bigger skill. So if you just take about 30 seconds and brainstorm, if you're by yourself, great. And if you're with a partner in your office on the webinar together, just brain dump. What are some things that might go into how a classroom teacher or how a support staff would need to break down this skill within kind of an instructional approach or within that kind of lesson plan format? Okay, so a couple of things that you might have thought about would be we'd have to use some active listening. We'd have to also be really keenly aware of our own emotions. You probably have to be able to identify some emotions. I know I need to identify if I'm feeling uncomfortable or upset about something that's being said, I need to first name that and then kind of decide how am I going to react. So there might be some decision making that's also being done within that I need to kind of be aware of as a participant in that classroom discussion if I'm one of those students. We also want to think about maybe express emotions in a way that keeps others safe and your image clean. Maybe we transfer that indicator, maybe that's something that shows up in a school-wide matrix under hallway expectations, because we've noticed that there seems to be, through our data, we know that students tend to get into verbal altercations or use inappropriate verbal language in the hallway. So how we would teach that, or how, some considerations for the instruction or the deeper level skills that would go into that is going to be different, right? How I need to express my emotions in a hallway is very different than within a classroom academic environment or setting. So some other things we might consider would be things in the bigger buckets, like self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, like listening and respect, and showing, kind of being able to participate in classroom discussions. We'd also want to make sure that we connect that why within our instruction. So while the why doesn't go on the matrix, it should be an active part of our instruction and support of students. Kim, what else would you add in terms of expressing emotions and how that applies, kind of transfers from the matrix as an indicator or something that we're going to prioritize and value to how that shows up with social emotional learning?
Aside from the two good points you mentioned on that, it may depend on how we define that, and the skills that could further support might depend on the environment. I think the only other thing to mention is that there are just so many, for some more than others, but there are so many social and emotional skills that go into these larger skills. So for example, with this one, I have managing frustration, staying calm, but you could really go on and on, because there's managing anxiety, a lot of empathy skills, handling strong emotions, managing frustration, being able to recognize and solve conflicts, avoiding jumping to conclusions, and you could go on and on. So it's just really helpful to kind of think. I think the matrix is just a really good place where they support and complement each other. The other thing that's really helpful with the matrix is if you're thinking about in the classroom, when you see a lot of students struggling with expressing their emotions in a way that keeps others safe, you could break that down and look at what skills have we taught, what have we supported already, what might we need to go back and support again for all students. So it really just kind of helps you identify what students may be struggling with and where they might need, where there might need to be changes in adult practices for further student support.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the only other thing that I would add too before we move on is that this particular indicator came from a high school that I worked with a number of years ago. And, I don't know how many of you on the webinar today are from middle or high schools, but sometimes, the translation to higher grade levels and implementation of PBIS, can be a little bit difficult, and I get that. And so this particular high school team was really working hard to say, how do we take this PBIS framework, but use it in a way that works for us, you know, and that gives our staff the tools that they need to be successful, right, with the students and with implementation. And when they landed on this, you know, express emotions in a way that keeps others safe and your image clean, it gave their team and it gave their entire staff some language to use with the students that wasn't quote unquote babyish. You know, it wasn't trying to dumb down anything or kind of, you know, make anything goofy or silly or uncomfortable for the staff to prompt their students in a consistent way. And so I think that's important to point out that this indicator came out really organically from the team, but also as a tool for the staff members so that it gave them more language. It gave them, the adults, some scaffolded support in supporting their students and doing a new thing. You know, the high school teachers were not super comfortable at supporting students' social and emotional skills more purposefully. You know, they had been doing it, whether they knew it or not, for a long time. And now with the PBIS implementation, it was really kind of pushing people to be more intentional about that. And it not only gave a teaching tool for students, but also gave some support to the staff. So I think that's important to point out, that a matrix does as much for the staff as it does for the students, if not more. The only other last kind of couple things that we really want to mention just to bookend this conversation is that you've heard us say a number of times to kind of use an instructional approach within your PBIS framework as much as you can by defining those skills, you know, using your data, and then past actively teaching it. We really want, you know, leadership teams and school staff to think about purposeful reteaching, you know, through the use of their data, to know, did the students really learn this skill within this context, or do we need to come back and practice this again? And how can we kind of adjust our instruction and our support so that students have the skills that they need to be successful? We also want to consider prompting within that. And it doesn't have to be anything more than just a quick 2-minute reminder or, hey, we're about ready to start our whole group discussion. Remember, we're going to keep in mind expressing our emotions in a way that keeps your image, you know, your image clean and, you know, whatever. I said it so many times, in a way that, keeps others safe and your image clean. So prior to transitions, prior to that new routine, prior to that new activity, reminding students of what has already been taught so that they can kind of gear up to practice it within that context. Doing so also kind of helps to prevent some correction that might be needed, error correction in terms of students, you know, the ways that they are engaging with each other or the work. The other thing that's really important and often overlooked is the use of feedback. So we talk a lot about feedback in the context of academic learning and academic skill acquisition, and it is just as important within student social and emotional skill acquisition. And so, you know, we want to keep it brief and correctional if needed, or corrective if needed, but really focus on what the student is doing well and how they are growing towards the bigger skills. So how are they, you know, when we outlined all of the bigger skills that go into actively listening to the teacher or speaker, how are they growing in all of those things? And feedback can be a really powerful force to help provide that instruction. We can certainly increase the rate of any one of these actually, or decrease the rate, but we want to purposefully fade back when we see that students are actually using the skills and are becoming fluent in them, not just within one setting, but they can transfer that learning to other settings. The other thing to keep in mind is that, you know, oftentimes with implementing new things or refining particular staff practices like instruction or defining skills within a matrix, we can get really caught up in that work. It's really important and valuable work, and it takes a whole bunch of time. You know, it's a significant investment in our student and in improving student outcomes that we're doing. But we have to keep in mind that the improvement in those student outcomes and that learning is really the desired outcome. We want to make sure, we want to not leave it to chance, that students do know how and are able to perform these really critical skills across settings, because they have been taught and supported in doing so. So Kim mentioned this earlier, but I think it's a good point to kind of end on, is that, you know, just because we taught something in September one time, or October we have a theme of the month and teach that skill, those can be really important jumping off points, but we have to come back to it through our prompting, our modeling, our practice, our feedback, so that students do actually internalize and use these skills, you know, for their, not only for successful navigation of the school environment, but throughout their day and throughout their lives. So learning is the desired outcome. That is why we do this work, so that we are improving the student outcomes and we are equipping students to be successful in their world and world of work. Couple of other things, Kim, we want to point out a couple of references.
Sure. Yep. So these are a couple that we thought would just sort of extend the learning from on some of the topics from today. So the first resource, really, Susan Barrett is one of the main writers of that article, and talks a lot about how you can support social and emotional competencies within a PBIS framework. And it's a quick read. I think it's only about 2 pages, maybe 3, but it's a short article and gives more examples to some of the things we weren't able to go in depth into today. The other thing that I wanted to mention is the Aspen resource. And one of the things that addresses is defining expectations through a more culturally responsive lens. And then also it talks about the danger of defining expectations and indicators as a dominant group, and what we can do about that. So these are 2 main references. We didn't want to throw a bunch at you, but these are 2 big ones that we thought you might find very useful. And with that, we would love to open the remaining time for any questions that you have for us.
So if you have some questions, put them in the chat box, and I will share them. One thing I was just really struck by is how, and you guys mentioned this at the beginning, but how the 2 approaches, SEL and PBIS, actually support one another in a pretty equal way. And it occurred to me, when you're looking at your matrix and you've got those skills and they break down, right? And kids don't necessarily follow them the way that we hope that they do. If we can identify the sub-skills that are social emotional skills within that, and identify where that breakdown is actually happening, we can do more in the classroom to make the kids successful. It's a really nice marriage of those things, I think. So thank you for sharing that. This webinar will be available. It will be recorded. It just has to go through our closed captioning process, which got slowed down a little bit with some staff changes, so please be patient, but it will be on the website. Other questions or thoughts? I think that Kim and Emily did a really great job of taking a really large, somewhat troublesome idea of how to integrate approaches and gave you examples of some very specific ways to do that. So I appreciate that so much, ladies. I will get the website for you to put on there. So all of these webinars go on the table that's on the Social Emotional Learning and Conference website. Any other questions for Emily or Kim? And just so you know, Kim also was on the team that helped to develop the SEL competencies, the Wisconsin competencies. And maybe, Kim, just a really quick question, given that you've got some real familiarity with those because you worked on them and the PBIS, Do you see the Wisconsin competencies being useful in breaking down those sub-skills of those matricy expectations?
Yes.
Okay.
And by age or grade level, right?
Mm-hmm.
Age appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great part of
That's a
that
good point.
resource.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I
Sometimes
think, and if I could just, I worked with a couple of districts recently who were trained in PBIS a long time ago, but now we're really wanting to dig more purposefully, I should say, into social emotional learning and into their SEL work. And they used the matrix and then also took the Wisconsin competencies and kind of did a nice, inventory audit to kind of say which ones do we feel like we're really covering really well, and then what are the other kind of bigger buckets that we're not, and how do we start to differentiate that within grade levels, because they had some pretty common ones across K5 or 6-8. And it really, like you said, Beth, kind of helped to articulate further instead of just trying to do it by guesswork,
Right.
or a team's background knowledge, which is usually rich and robust, but at least they had something concrete to give them that roadmap to start the work or to kind of refine the work.
Emily, is that anything that we could get to share, like an example of what they did to share?
That's a great question. You know what? I don't mind asking, and I will let you know.
That would be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
And also, Emily and I have been talking about, we always do an SEL session at the PBIS conference, and we've been talking about some school examples for that. So.
Yeah, I think people really appreciate being able to see the actual steps that schools take, because sometimes this seems like a pretty big task when we're talking about integration. So yeah, that would be really appreciated. So
yeah, I think.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that's the beauty of this first resource here, that teaching social emotional competencies within a PBIS framework, is that it really simplifies things. And I think if teams can create the time and space to have those conversations and do that work, which can be a big part of the challenge right there, is finding the time to do it. It's really about just being very purposeful about the decisions the team is making about who is responsible for overseeing implementation of this, and how are we going to do that? How are we going to support our staff? And how are we going to refine some of the practices that we already do and are good at and fluent at and consistent at, to include just a few other kind of nuances within the work?
Yeah. Well, I'm not getting any more questions through the chat box, but you will have access to this program. And Emily, are you able to put up the first slide really quickly where your email addresses are? If you have any other questions that come up or that you want to ask Emily or Kim specifically, their emails are right here. And I know that both would be very open to taking your questions. I will say that Emily and Kim have been on board since we started doing all of this work at the state level on how to make these two approaches, how to not make them, but how to demonstrate to people this alignment. And they've been working on this for a long time, and I'm really pleased they were able to share this with you. So thank you so much, you guys. It was really good. And
well, thank you, Beth. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
You're our go-tos. So if you have questions for them specifically, please feel free to do that. You can also email me if you have any other questions as well. I will work with Emily and Kim to see if we can get some examples of how this is done, so we can make those available to you if you'd like to see how some schools have worked through this process, looking at the competencies as well as their matrix. And with that, I'm going to end the session here, and thank you all for joining us. We have one more webinar in our SEL webinar series next month in May. Jess Nichols will be joining us to talk about using the SEL competencies and bringing SEL into IEPs and IEP development. So thank you for joining us, and hope to see you all next month. Thanks, Kim and Emily.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.